The first drops of blood fell not on a battlefield but in the shadowed alcoves of Westminster Palace, where in the spring of 1450 a trembling courtier whispered into the ear of Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, that the Commons were baying for his head outside the very walls where he stood, their voices rising like a tide against the crumbling sea defences of a regime that had already begun to devour itself from within. Somerset's hands, which had lost Normandy to the French just months earlier, now clutched at documents bearing the royal seal, documents that promised him protection from a king whose mind had begun its slow retreat into the mysterious fog that would soon leave England rudderless at precisely the moment when strong hands were most desperately needed on the tiller of state. The Commons knew nothing of what fermented in the private chambers of power, how the loss of France had transformed the English nobility from a class of warriors with foreign fields to conquer into a pack of famished wolves eyeing one another across an increasingly confined hunting ground, where the only remaining prey was each other, and the officers' lands and revenues that had once seemed boundless when Agincourt's glory still shimmered fresh in memory, in the manor houses scattered across Yorkshire and the Welsh marches, in the fortified keeps of the northern borderlands where the stone grew dark with perpetual rain. Younger sons of noble houses fingered the pommels of swords that their fathers had carried into France, swords that had tasted French blood and brought home French gold, and these young men listened to their elders speak in increasingly desperate tones about retinues that could no longer be maintained, about rents from Norman estates that would never again fill the coffers, about the king's household swollen with favourites who dispensed patronage to their own creatures, while ancient families found their petitions ignored, their claims on royal grants dismissed, their lawsuits buried under the weight of a justice system that had become little more than an extension of factional interest. The wool merchants of London, counting their coins in counting houses that smelled of tallow and ambition, had begun to notice how the great lords no longer spoke of trade routes and customs revenues, but instead of musters and retinues, how the conversation in the better taverns had shifted from commercial opportunity to armed men, and who could call upon how many lances at a day's notice. And the merchants felt the cold wind of coming chaos even as they calculated how such chaos might be turned to profit. For there are always fortunes to be made when the old order trembles. Richard Plantagenet, 3rd Duke of York, stood in the great hall of his castle at Ludlow in the late summer of 1450, and read once more the letters that had arrived from his estates in Ireland, where he had been effectively exiled by Somerset and the court party, sent to govern a turbulent lordship on the very fringe of English power, while lesser men enriched themselves on offices and grants that should by rights have belonged to the Premier Duke of the realm, a man whose blood ran more purely royal than that of the addled king himself, descended as York was from Edward III through both his father and his mother, a double claim that whispered of possibilities that in saner times would have remained forever unspoken, but which now, with Henry VI's mind clouding, and his queen Margaret of Anjou grasping at the reins of power with the desperation of a foreigner who knew she would never be loved by the English people, began to echo in the darker recesses of noble councils. York's household knights watched their lord's face as he read, and they saw the muscle work in his jaw, saw the way his fingers whitened on the parchment, and they knew without words that the time of waiting had ended, that the great wheel of fortune that had raised and cast down so many noble houses was beginning another of its terrible revolutions, and each man calculated in the privacy of his own thoughts which way the momentum would carry them, and whether their own small fortunes would rise or fall with the coming tide. The roads between London and the northern estates of the Percy family carried more traffic than usual that autumn, riders wearing the crescent badge moving with purpose through villages where peasants looked up from their harvest labour and crossed themselves, knowing that when lords' messengers rode in such numbers and with such haste, the common folk would soon enough be called upon to pay the price in blood or coin or both. Henry Percy, 2nd Earl of Northumberland, had his own concerns about the balance of power in the north, where the Neville family had grown too mighty for comfort, their landholdings expanding through strategic marriages and royal favour until they threatened to eclipse the ancient preeminence of the Percys in the region, where for generations it had been understood that the king's peace depended upon Percy power. The enmity between Percy and Neville ran deeper than mere competition for office. It was woven into the fabric of a northern society, into disputes over grazing rights and market privileges, into blood feuds sparked by insults real and imagined, into the fundamental question of which family would speak for the north when the great matters of the realm were decided. And this enmity would prove one of the many fissures through which the poison of civil war would seep into the body politic, turning local rivalry into national catastrophe. Margaret of Anjou, who had arrived in England as a 15-year-old bride bringing not the promised provinces of Maine and Anjou as her dowry, but rather their surrender back to France, had learned quickly that the English nobility regarded her with barely concealed contempt. This foreign woman who had failed to produce an heir for 7 long years, while the question of succession hung like a blade above the realm, and she had responded to their contempt with a steely determination to gather power into her own hands, to build a faction at court that would protect her position and advance her interests regardless of the cost to the broader stability of the kingdom. In the Queen's chambers, where French was spoken as often as the English and where the fashions ran to continental styles that the English ladies whispered were immodest, Margaret met with Somerset and the other lords of her party, and they spoke of York as a threat to be neutralised, never understanding or perhaps not caring that in treating the king's premier subject as an enemy, they were lighting a fire that would consume them all. For York commanded loyalty not merely through his wealth and blood, but through a reputation for capable governance that stood in stark contrast to the chaos and favouritism that characterised the court regime. The winter of 1450 brought hardship to the villages that clustered around the great estates, where the failure of the grain harvest combined with increased demands for feudal service created conditions in which the ancient bonds between lord and tenant began to fray. Peasants questioning why they should starve so that knights could maintain war horses that would be ridden not against England's foreign enemies, but against other Englishmen, other villages, other peasants who spoke the same tongue and prayed to the same god. In the monasteries, where chronicles were kept, and where learned men attempted to discern the pattern of providence in earthly events, the monks noted ominous signs: comets visible at midday, calves born with 2 heads, a rain of blood reported in Gloucestershire that was probably nothing more than red dust blown from distant deserts, but which seemed to the credulous an unmistakable divine warning that the shedding of blood would soon drench the land. The abbot of St Albans, whose monastery held extensive properties, and whose loyalty would be tested by the competing demands of York and the court, spent long hours in prayer seeking guidance that never came, for God's purposes remained as inscrutable as ever, while the choices facing men of property and position grew more stark with each passing month. When York finally returned from Ireland in September of 1450 without royal permission, landing in Wales with a small army at his back, the court party recognised the challenge even as they feigned incomprehension, demanding to know by what authority the Duke presumed to raise men and march toward London, and York responded with manifestos and declarations that spoke of his desire only to remove the evil councillors who surrounded the king, to restore good governance and drive out the corruption that had lost France and was now bleeding England, never once mentioning the crown itself but allowing the implications of his royal blood to work upon the minds of those who heard him. The city of London, whose merchants and aldermen had their own grievances against Somerset's regime, and the debts it had incurred, opened its gates to York with enthusiasm that must have chilled the hearts of the court party. For London's wealth and London's strategic position made it the hinge upon which any struggle for power would ultimately turn, and York's ability to command the city's loyalty suggested reserves of support that went far beyond his own retainers and tenants. Yet this first crisis passed without the clash of armies, Henry VI emerging briefly from his bewilderment to broker a reconciliation that satisfied no one and resolved nothing. Somerset retaining his offices while York withdrew to his estates with nothing accomplished save the demonstration that armed force could extract concessions from a weak crown, a lesson that would not be forgotten and that guaranteed future repetitions of the same dangerous dance. In the great households, stewards and receivers began the work of calculating what resources could be mobilised should the next crisis require military action. How many men could be raised from the estates? What equipment would be needed? Where supplies could be secured? Transforming the administration of noble estates from exercises in agricultural management and rent collection into preparations for war. And these preparations were conducted with remarkable openness, as though the nobility had collectively decided that civil war was now simply another aspect of political life that required practical planning rather than moral horror. The year 1452 brought York's second armed demonstration against the court, this time resulting in the humiliating spectacle of the Duke kneeling before the king at Dartford and swearing an oath of loyalty after his support melted away, the other lords who had whispered encouragement in private now stepping back from open confrontation, and York returned to his estates nursing a sense of betrayal that would harden into implacable determination, for a man of his rank and blood could not be subjected to such humiliation twice, without either submitting permanently to political irrelevance, or else pursuing the logic of his position to its ultimate conclusion, which was to say the crown itself, though that final step still lay months and years ahead, obscured by the forms of loyalty and the fiction that good King Henry was merely misled by evil counsellors, rather than fundamentally incapable of ruling. The court's triumph at Dartford proved short-lived, however, for in the late summer of 1453 the king's mind finally and completely gave way, Henry falling into a catatonic state from which no pleading could rouse him, his eyes open but unseeing, his body maintained by servants who fed and cleaned him like an infant while the kingdom drifted without direction, and the Queen discovered that her political manoeuvring had earned her enemies, but not the institutional power to govern in her husband's place. In this vacuum of authority, while Henry sat unmoving in his chambers and Margaret struggled to maintain her faction's grip on the machinery of government, Queen Margaret gave birth in October 1453 to a son, Edward of Westminster, whose arrival should have secured the succession and stabilised the realm, but which instead raised questions that circulated in whispers through every noble household and every London tavern, for the king had been incapacitated for months before the child's birth, and many wondered whether Henry in his clouded mental state had been capable of begetting an heir. Whispers of illegitimacy that attached themselves to the infant prince, and that Somerset's enemies were all too happy to encourage, for if the child were indeed a bastard then the succession remained open, and York's claim through his descent from Edward III became all the more compelling. The actual truth of the child's parentage was perhaps less important than the fact that so many were willing to believe the worst, willing to embrace any narrative that justified their own factional positions and personal ambitions. For in the breakdown of trust that characterises the approach of civil war, every event becomes subject to competing interpretations and objective. Truth loses its power to bind men to a common understanding of reality. York's appointment as protector of the realm during the king's incapacity marked the high point of his constitutional approach to seizing power, for he now held legal authority to govern while avoiding the taint of usurpation, and he used this authority to move against his enemies within the framework of established procedures, imprisoning Somerset on charges of treason and corruption, replacing members of the court party in key offices, beginning the work of reforming the household and the finances, demonstrating the capable governance that had eluded the regime he displaced. But the protectorate rested entirely on the king's continued incapacity, and when Henry emerged from his stupor in the final days of 1454, greeting his infant son as though no time had passed, and as though the kingdom had not been transformed in his absence, York's legal authority evaporated like morning mist, and he found himself once again facing a court dominated by the Queen and Somerset, now doubly hostile for having tasted imprisonment and loss of power. The nobility watched this reversal with growing unease, for it demonstrated that no settlement could be permanent, while the king's health remained unreliable, that any arrangement might be overturned not by political process, but by the random functioning or misfunctioning of Henry's troubled mind, and this uncertainty made armed power rather than legal right the only reliable foundation for political survival. Somerset's release from the Tower in February 1455 and his immediate restoration to favour convinced York that the time for constitutional manoeuvring had passed, that the court party would never accept his preeminence and would move against him as soon as they felt strong enough to do so, and this conviction was shared by Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, whose own family rivalry with the Percys had allied him firmly with York, and by Warwick's father, the Earl of Salisbury, whose military experience and northern power base made him an invaluable partner in the confrontation that all now recognised as inevitable. The three lords began gathering their retinues in the spring of 1455, summoning their tenant knights and their household men, hiring mercenaries where their own resources fell short, transforming their estates into armed camps from which they would march to settle by force of arms what could not be settled by law or persuasion. And the remarkable fact was not that they did this, but that they did it openly, sending messages to the king explaining their actions even as they marched toward London with thousands of armed men, maintaining the fiction that they were loyal subjects defending themselves against traitors in the king's council, even as they prepared to fight the king's army in the king's presence. The first battle of this new war took place on May 22nd, 1455, in the narrow streets of St. Albans, a confused and brutal affair that barely deserved the name of battle, more a street fight between armed retinues than a properly deployed military engagement. But what it lacked in military sophistication, it more than compensated for in political consequence, for in the space of a few hours of fighting, Somerset lay dead in the street outside the Castle Inn, cut down by Yorkist soldiers who had hunted him specifically, and Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, also fell, continuing the blood feud between Percy and Neville into a new and deadlier phase, and the king himself sustained an arrow wound to the neck, a physical violation of royal sanctity that should have been unthinkable, but which now became simply a fact to be managed and explained away. York and his allies had won the immediate engagement, but in winning it they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, for they had drawn the king's blood and killed the king's ministers in the king's presence, and no amount of protestation about evil counsellors could disguise the fundamental challenge to royal authority that such actions represented. The 3 years following St. Albans brought a brittle peace maintained by York's second protectorate and the temporary exhaustion of both sides. But beneath this surface calm the Queen worked tirelessly to build a new party capable of challenging the Yorkist lords, drawing to her cause nobles who feared York's growing power or who saw opportunity in the Queen's patronage, and she found ready allies among the northern lords whose regional interests aligned them against the Nevilles, and among the remnants of the old court party who thirsted for revenge against their father's killers. Margaret of Anjou revealed herself in these years as a political actor of formidable capability. Her foreignness and femininity disadvantages she turned to advantage by positioning herself as the fierce protector of her son's inheritance against the ambitions of overmighty subjects, and she moved the centre of royal power away from London and the south, where York's influence was greatest, to the Midlands and the north, where she could build military strength beyond the reach of the Yorkist interference. The nobility divided itself with inexorable logic into two parties, not initially based on any clear principle of governance or policy, but rather on personal connection, family alliance, regional rivalry, and calculation of advantage, the great families pulling their client gentry and their tenant farmers into alignments that would determine who lived and who died over the coming decade. In the manors and towns of England, men who had no direct stake in the quarrels of the great found themselves forced to choose sides or have sides chosen for them, for neutrality became increasingly difficult when both parties demanded men and money, and when refusal to provide them to one side was interpreted as support for the other, and so the retinues that gathered around the competing lords swelled with men who fought not from conviction, but from necessity, from fear of their lord's displeasure or hope of their lord's reward, men who would switch sides with bewildering frequency as the wheel of fortune turned, and yesterday's victor became tomorrow's fugitive. The bonds of lordship that had organised medieval English society into a hierarchy of mutual obligation now became the mechanism by which the entire realm was dragged into civil conflict. For a tenant could no more refuse his lord's call to arms than he could refuse to pay his rent, and a lord who failed to support his patron risked losing everything, so that the entire structure of society became a transmission belt, carrying men toward violence whether they willed it or not. The uneasy peace shattered finally in 1459 when Yorkist lords once again gathered their forces, this time at Ludlow, York's stronghold in the Welsh Marches, but the confrontation that should have renewed the battle instead collapsed when a significant portion of the Yorkist army, including the Calais garrison that Warwick had brought across the Channel, refused to fight against the king's person who advanced with the royal standard displayed, and York and his allies found their support melting away in the darkness of an October night, forcing them to flee, York to Ireland and the Nevilles to Calais, abandoning their lands and their followers to the mercies of a queen who had none. The Parliament that met at Coventry in November 1459 packed with the Queen's supporters and lacking any Yorkist presence, attainted York, Warwick, Salisbury and their adherents, declaring them traitors and forfeit of all lands and goods, a legal annihilation that should have ended the conflict but which instead simply raised the stakes. For men with nothing left to lose become desperate and dangerous, and the Yorkist lords now had no path back to their former positions except through complete victory and the overthrow of the regime that had condemned them. From their exile in Calais, which Warwick controlled as captain through a combination of military force, and the loyalty of the garrison whom he paid regularly, unlike the impecunious crown, the Yorkist earls planned their return, and in June 1460 they landed in Kent, with a small army stiffened by the professional soldiers of the Calais garrison, men who had fought in France, and who brought a level of military capability that the amateur retinue forces could not match. Kent and London rose to support them, the city opening its gates as it had done before, and the Yorkist army marched north to confront the Queen's forces, meeting them at Northampton on July 10, 1460, where the battle was decided not by military superiority but by the treachery of Lord Grey of Ruthin, who commanded part of the Royalist army and who had secretly agreed to defect during the fighting, turning his section of the line and allowing Warwick's men to storm into the Lancastrian camp where they cut down the Duke of Buckingham and other lords, but carefully preserved the king, capturing Henry once more and bringing him back to London as their prisoner and their legitimising figurehead. The Queen, who had remained in the Midlands with the young Prince Edward, fled north when she learned of the disaster, and for a brief moment it seemed that the Yorkists had won a decisive victory, controlling the king and the capital and the machinery of government. But they had not captured or killed Margaret, and as long as she remained free with her son, the embodiment of the Lancastrian claim, the conflict would continue. York's return from Ireland in September 1460 brought a new and shocking element to the political equation, for the Duke no longer bothered to maintain the fiction that he sought merely to counsel the king or remove evil ministers, instead marching into Westminster Hall and laying his hand upon the empty throne in a gesture that unmistakably declared his intention to claim the crown for himself. And the lords who had supported him out of personal loyalty or factional interest now found themselves confronted with the prospect of actual usurpation, of setting aside the anointed king and his son in favour of York's claim through descent from an earlier generation of Edward III's sons. The peers assembled in Parliament recoiled from this direct assault on legitimacy, however weak and incapable Henry might be, and even Warwick, who owed everything to York, tried to find some middle path that would preserve the forms of kingship while securing York's position, and the compromise they reached, the Act of Accord of October 1460, attempted to square the circle by allowing Henry to reign for his lifetime, while making York and York's heirs the successors to the throne, disinheriting the Prince of Wales and guaranteeing future conflict. For Margaret would never accept such a settlement, and the northern lords who supported the Lancastrian cause would not abandon the prince whose rights they had sworn to uphold. Margaret of Anjou spent the autumn of 1460 in the north, raising an army among the northern lords and the Scottish border families who cared little for the niceties of parliamentary settlements, and much for the traditional bonds of lordship and the promise of plunder, and she gathered a force that contemporary chroniclers numbered in the tens of thousands. Though such numbers were surely exaggerated, yet even discounting the chroniclers' tendency to inflate, it was certainly the largest army yet assembled in this conflict, a host of northerners who marched south flying the prince's banner and singing songs of vengeance against the southern lords who had tried to steal their young prince's birthright. York, confident in his military prowess and perhaps contemptuous of what he regarded as an army of half-barbarous northerners, marched north from London in early December with a much smaller force, intending to scatter the Lancastrian army before it could grow stronger, and he reached his castle at Sandal near Wakefield, and there decided to give his men rest before engaging the enemy, a decision that would cost him everything, for on December 30th, 1460, the Lancastrian forces surrounded Sandal Castle, and through means that remain disputed drew York out into a battle where he was hopelessly outnumbered. The Battle of Wakefield ended with York dead on the field, and his second son, the 17-year-old Edmund Earl of Rutland, hunted down and killed either during the battle or shortly after, executed by Lord Clifford, who reportedly declared that the death was payment for Clifford's own father, killed at St Albans 5 years before, and the Earl of Salisbury was captured and beheaded the following day, and the heads of these great lords were mounted on spikes above Micklegate Bar in York, with York's head crowned with a paper crown in mockery of his royal pretensions, a savage gesture that demonstrated how far the conflict had descended from the formal courtesies of aristocratic warfare into something darker and more vicious. The destruction of York should have ended the Yorkist cause, but instead it simply transferred leadership to his eldest son, Edward Earl of March, an 18-year-old who had inherited his father's claim to the throne and who would prove a far more capable military commander than the father whose political ambitions had launched the family on its deadly trajectory, and the Neville Earls Warwick and his brother John Lord Montague rallied to the new claimant, bringing their military resources and their political connections to bear, in support of a young man who had everything to fight for and nothing to lose. Margaret's northern army marched south toward London in the weeks after Wakefield, a host that lived off the land and whose passage was marked by plundering and violence that the chroniclers, admittedly hostile to the Lancastrian cause, described in lurid detail, tales of rape and robbery and sacrilege that spread terror before the army's advance and that turned the prosperous south against the Queen's cause more effectively than any Yorkist propaganda could have done. For the northerners were depicted and perhaps behaved as foreign invaders, despoiling the realm rather than as the king's loyal subjects fighting to defend their rightful prince. Warwick attempted to stop the Lancastrian advance at St Albans in mid-February 1461, bringing a substantial army and deploying it with all the careful preparation that his military experience suggested. But the Second Battle of St Albans proved a disaster for the Yorkist cause, the Lancastrian forces outmanoeuvring Warwick's positions and falling upon his army from an unexpected direction, scattering the Yorkist forces and recapturing King Henry, who had been brought along by Warwick and who now returned to his wife's custody after spending months as a Yorkist prisoner, and the road to London lay open before Margaret's victorious army. Yet London refused to open its gates to the northern host, the mayor and aldermen fearing that admission of the undisciplined Lancastrian forces would mean the sack of the city, and Margaret lacked the resources for a prolonged siege, her army already beginning to dissolve as northerners laden with plunder headed back to their homes, and so in one of the most fateful decisions of the entire conflict, the Queen withdrew her army back toward the north, abandoning London and the political legitimacy it represented to her enemies. And this withdrawal allowed Edward of York, who had won a significant victory over Lancastrian forces in the Welsh marches at Mortimer's Cross, to enter London in early March and to claim what his father had died attempting to seize. On March 4th, 1461, before an assembly of Lords and Commons, Edward of York was proclaimed King Edward the Thaw, the fiction of defending the rights of Henry VI finally abandoned, and the usurpation that York had hinted at now accomplished by his son, a tall and handsome youth whose charm and military success contrasted sharply with the ineffectual Henry. And while the proclamation had no legal validity beyond the power to enforce it, Edward and his supporters moved quickly to transform military success into political legitimacy through the mechanisms of coronation and parliamentary recognition. But these formalities would have to wait, for Margaret's army remained in the north, a threat that required immediate military response, and Edward gathered the largest army he could muster and marched north toward a confrontation that both sides recognised as decisive, for England could not sustain two kings indefinitely, and the coming battle would determine which claimant would rule and which would fall into ruin or death. The armies met near the village of Towton in Yorkshire on March 29, 1461, in the midst of a snowstorm that blew into the faces of the Lancastrian forces and that gave advantage to the Yorkist archers, whose arrows carried farther with the wind while the Lancastrian arrows fell short, and the battle that followed was the largest and bloodiest ever fought on English soil. Contemporary chronicles claiming casualties in the tens of thousands, though such numbers must be treated with scepticism. Yet even conservative modern estimates suggest that more than 10,000 men died in the fighting and the rout that followed, a slaughter that exceeded anything England had experienced in its foreign wars and that decimated the nobility on both sides, great lords and simple knights falling together in the press of battle, or cut down while fleeing across the frozen fields. The Lancastrian army broke finally after hours of fighting, and the retreat became a massacre as Yorkist cavalry pursued the fleeing soldiers for miles, cutting them down without mercy, for Edward had reportedly given orders to spare the common soldiers, but to kill the lords and knights, those who had led the opposition to his father and to his own claim, and the rivers ran red with blood according to the chroniclers. The Cock Beck so choked with bodies that men crossed on bridges of corpses, and whether these details are literal truth or literary embellishment, they capture the scale of the killing and the savagery that had come to characterise this conflict between Englishmen. Margaret and Henry fled north after Towton, first to Scotland where they sought aid from the young King James III in exchange for promises of English territory. The Queen reduced to bargaining away her kingdom's lands for temporary refuge and military support, and then briefly to France, where Louis XV had played a complex game of offering just enough assistance to keep the Lancastrian cause alive without committing resources to its full restoration. For a weak and divided England served French interest better than a strong realm under either Lancaster or York. Edward IV, meanwhile, consolidated his power in the South and Midlands, rewarding his supporters with the forfeited estates of attainted Lancastrians, creating a new nobility bound to the Yorkist regime by the gift of lands that could only be retained if the regime survived, and he proved an able administrator and an astute politician, his youth and vigour bringing energy to governance that Henry's troubled reign had lacked, though beneath the surface stability the foundations remained shaky, for the Lancastrians still controlled much of the north, and numerous castles remained in their hands, requiring a slow campaign of sieges and negotiations to reduce them one by one. The Lancastrian resistance in Northumberland continued through 1462 and into 1463, a stubborn guerrilla campaign based on the great castles of Bamburgh, Alnwick, and Dunstanburgh, strongholds that the Scots helped to resupply and that served as bases for raids into Yorkist territory, and Edward was forced to campaign repeatedly in the north, bringing artillery to batter the thick walls and offering generous terms to garrisons that surrendered, while promising no quarter to those who resisted, and slowly the Lancastrian enclaves fell, the garrisons accepting pardons and going home, the great lords fleeing once more to Scotland or to the continent, until by the end of 1463 the military phase of the conflict seemed to have ended with Edward's victory complete, Henry VI a fugitive somewhere in the northern wilderness, and Margaret across the sea begging for aid that never came in sufficient quantity to threaten the established regime. Yet the peace that descended on England after 1463 was built on unstable foundations, for Edward's kingship lacked the deep legitimacy that came from undisputed hereditary succession, and his power rested heavily on the support of the Neville family, particularly Richard Earl of Warwick, who had become the most powerful nobleman in the realm, loaded with offices and estates, and the informal title of Kingmaker that recognised his role in Edward's rise to the throne. And Warwick expected that his support would translate into dominant influence over royal policy, particularly in the crucial matter of the king's marriage, which would determine the foreign alliances and the factional balance of the new regime. Warwick pursued negotiations for Edward's marriage to a French princess, part of a broader diplomatic strategy of alliance with Louis VII against Burgundy. But in September 1464, Edward revealed that he had already married, secretly and without consulting his council, having wed an English widow named Elizabeth Woodville, whose Lancastrian connections and relatively modest family background shocked the nobility and infuriated Warwick, who saw in the marriage a repudiation of his own counsel and a dangerous empowerment of a new family that would compete for the royal favour that Warwick regarded as his by right. Elizabeth Woodville brought with her an extensive family of brothers and sisters, who Edward now proceeded to advance with lavish generosity, arranging prestigious marriages for the Woodville siblings that tied them to great estates and noble titles, creating a new court faction that did not owe its position to the Nevilles, and that pursued different policies, particularly in foreign affairs where the Woodvilles favoured alliance with Burgundy against France, the opposite of Warwick's preferred alignment, and the kingdom thus acquired two competing centres of power and influence. The old nobility represented by Warwick, who believed his service entitled him to preeminence, and the new court party built around the Queen's family who enjoyed the king's favour and personal affection. The factional competition might have remained manageable had Edward possessed his father's political caution, but the young king had grown accustomed to having his own way, and he lacked patience for the careful management of noble egos that successful kingship required, and when Warwick pressed his objections to royal policy too forcefully, Edward responded with irritation rather than conciliation, driving a wedge between the king and the earl whose power had made that kingship possible. The slow deterioration of the relationship between Edward and Warwick unfolded over years of accumulated slights and policy disagreements. The Earl watching his influence wane as the Woodvilles rose, and as Edward asserted his independence from the mentor who had guided him to the throne, and Warwick's pride, which was considerable, could not easily accept reduction from the dominant voice in the realm to merely one among several councillors, particularly when the policies he opposed seemed to him strategically misguided, and when the family that displaced him lacked the military resources and historical prestige that he brought to the regime. By 1469, Warwick had begun to contemplate what would have been unthinkable just years before, that he might need to discipline or even replace the king he had made, and he found a willing collaborator in Edward's own brother, George Duke of Clarence, a vain and foolish young man who resented Edward's greater success, and who Warwick cultivated with promises of advancement and perhaps even the crown itself, and together they began to plot rebellion, raising forces in the north under various pretexts while claiming to act in defence of the realm against the evil influence of the Woodvilles, the old rhetoric of removing evil councillors recycled for a new generation and a new conflict. The rebellion that Warwick and Clarence launched in 1469 achieved initial success, their forces defeating a royalist army at Edgecote and capturing the king himself, holding Edward prisoner while they attempted to govern in his name. But they discovered what York had learned a decade before, that capturing the king's person did not translate into the ability to govern effectively, for the realm would not accept orders issued in the name of a captive monarch by subjects who were transparently acting for their own benefit. And after several months of increasing chaos, Warwick was forced to release Edward and to accept a superficial reconciliation that fooled no one, for both sides now understood that armed conflict would resume as soon as either party felt strong enough to venture it. The reconciliation lasted barely a year before Warwick and Clarence rose again, this time fleeing to France when their initial moves failed to generate expected support, and in France they encountered Margaret of Anjou, who had spent years in impoverished exile, and Louis XV, seeing opportunity in the conflict between Edward and his former ally, brokered a stunning agreement by which Warwick would abandon the Yorkist cause and fight instead for the restoration of Henry VI, receiving in exchange a pardon for his treason and a promise that Clarence would be recognised as Henry's heir should the Lancastrian Prince Edward die without issue. The alliance between Warwick and Margaret, between the man who had destroyed the Lancastrian regime and the woman who had spent a decade fighting to restore it, was so improbable that many on both sides refused to believe it could be genuine. Yet necessity made strange bedfellows, and in September 1470, Warwick landed in England proclaiming that he came to restore King Henry, and the sped with which Edward the Thaw's support collapsed demonstrated the shallow foundations of Yorkist loyalty, nobles and commoners alike declaring for the readeption of Henry VI, the poor mad king who had spent the past 5 years imprisoned in the Tower, now brought forth and restored to his throne, dressed in a long blue gown and led through the streets of London like a puppet while Warwick ruled in his name. Edward IV fled to Burgundy, where his brother-in-law Duke Charles provided refuge and resources for an eventual return, and for 6 months England experienced the bizarre spectacle of Henry VI's restoration, a regime that satisfied no one and that existed only through Warwick's military power and French diplomatic support. The old Lancastrians could not trust Warwick, who had killed so many of their fellows, and the Yorkists who had accepted Henry's restoration did so only from opportunism and would abandon the cause as soon as Edward returned. Edward's invasion in March 1471 was a desperate gamble, landing with a small force at Ravenspuer in Yorkshire and claiming initially that he sought only to reclaim his Duchy of York, not the crown, a transparent fiction that allowed uncertain nobles to join him without openly committing treason. And as he marched south, his army grew, men who had abandoned him just months before now flocking to his standard. And crucially, Clarence, his brother, defected back to the Yorkist side, bringing his forces and his claim to loyalty that Edward forgave with remarkable political acumen, recognising that the coming battle with Warwick would require every available sword. The armies met at Barnet on April 14th, 1471, in a dawn fog so thick that formations could barely see one another, and in the confusion Lancastrian forces fired upon each other, and Warwick, who had attempted to fight on foot to encourage his men to stand firm, was cut down as the battle turned against him, the Kingmaker dying in the press of battle, without ever achieving the dominance over Edward that he had sought, and with Warwick's death the readeption collapsed, for there was no one else who could hold together the incompatible elements of the Lancastrian coalition. Margaret of Anjou had landed in England on the very day of the Battle of Barnet, bringing with her the Lancastrian Prince Edward, now 17 years old and ready to claim his father's throne by force of arms, and she gathered support in the West Country, raising an army from the traditional Lancastrian strongholds. But Edward Thorth moved with characteristic speed and energy, pursuing the Lancastrian army and bringing it to battle at Tewkesbury on May 4th, 1471, before it could unite with other Lancastrian forces in the north. The Battle of Tewkesbury ended with another crushing Yorkist victory, and in the rout that followed, the Prince of Wales was killed, cut down either in the fighting or shortly after, the exact circumstances obscured by conflicting accounts, but the result certain. The last Lancastrian heir of the body dead in the spring grass of Gloucestershire, and with him died the cause for which his mother had fought so long and sacrificed so much, for there was no longer any plausible Lancastrian claimant around whom opposition could coalesce. Margaret was captured and imprisoned, and Henry VI, who had been restored to the Tower after Barnet, died there on the night of May 21st, officially of melancholy at hearing the news of his son's death. But few doubted that Edward had ordered the former king's quiet murder. For as long as Henry lived, he presented a potential rallying point for dissent, and Edward had learned that mercy toward defeated enemies was a luxury that kings embroiled in civil war could not afford. The second reign of Edward IV, from 1471 until his death in 1483, brought England a period of relative peace and increasing prosperity, the king devoting himself to rebuilding royal finances and to the careful management of noble factions, balancing competing interests and ensuring that no single nobleman acquired the dominance that Warwick had wielded. And Edward proved capable of the sustained administrative effort that successful peacetime governance required, rebuilding the Crown's revenue through improved estate management and commercial ventures that would have scandalised earlier generations, but that freed him from dependence on parliamentary grants. The Lancastrian cause seemed extinguished, its leaders dead or in exile, its estates forfeited and distributed among Yorkist loyalists, and Edward's own marriage had produced children including 2 sons, ensuring the succession and providing the dynasty with the depth it needed to survive any future crisis. And England exhaled collectively, believing perhaps that the long nightmare of civil war had finally ended, and that the realm could return to the normal rhythms of commerce and agriculture and the slow accumulation of wealth that peace allowed. Yet beneath the surface stability, the forces that had generated civil war remained active, for the nobility had learned that armed force could change governments and redistribute property, that a king who displeased his subjects might be replaced by one more pliant or more capable, and this knowledge could not be unlearned no matter how firmly Edward seemed to grip the reins of power and the existence of Lancastrian exiles abroad, particularly Henry Tudor, the son of Margaret Beaufort and Edmund Tudor, who carried a tenuous claim to the throne through his mother's descent from John of Gaunt's illegitimate children legitimised by royal decree, ensured that there remained at least a theoretical alternative to Yorkist rule should circumstances ever turn against Edward's line. Edward himself seemed to recognise the fragility of what he had built, for he worked tirelessly to secure his son's succession, arranging marriages and making plans for a minority government should he die, while his heir was still young, trying to bind the nobility with oaths and institutional arrangements that would survive his own death. But he could not control the ambitions and fears that drove noble politics, and he could not prevent his own brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, from harbouring ambitions that would undo everything Edward had accomplished. When Edward IV died unexpectedly in April 1483, not yet 41 years old, worn out perhaps by the dissipations that the chroniclers described with varying degrees of salacious detail, he left a realm that appeared stable and prosperous, but that rested entirely on his personal authority and his ability to balance competing factions, and his death removed the keystone from the arch, and the structure began immediately to collapse as the Woodville family sought to secure control of the young Edward IV and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, moved to prevent what he claimed was a Woodville plot to monopolise power during the minority, and within weeks England had descended once more into political crisis as Richard seized the young king and arrested his Woodville relatives, and then, through a sequence of events that combined legal manoeuvring, political pressure, and outright violence, including the execution of Lord Hastings, who opposed his plans. Richard engineered his own proclamation as king on the grounds that Edward III's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, and their children therefore bastards, a claim that few believed but that served its purpose of providing legal cover for usurpation. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower, the 12-year-old Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, who were last seen in the summer of 1483 and who almost certainly were murdered on Richard III's orders, though definitive proof remained elusive, turned many who had initially supported Richard's protectorate against him. For whatever the legal arguments about the validity of Edward III's marriage, the murder of children was a crime that transgressed the unwritten codes that were supposed to govern even the bloodiest political struggles, and Richard found his support eroding even as he worked to establish his kingship through the traditional mechanisms of coronation and royal progress. Henry Tudor, who had spent most of his life in exile and whose claim to the throne was weak enough that he would never have been considered a serious candidate, had Edward IV's line remained intact, suddenly emerged as the focus of opposition to Richard, a figure around whom disaffected Yorkists who would never have supported a Lancastrian restoration could rally because Henry was only nominally Lancastrian, and because his very weakness as a claimant meant that he would be dependent on those who put him on the throne. Unlike a strong king who might have his own ideas about how to govern and whom to favour, the invasion that Henry Tudor launched in August 1485 was a modest affair. A force of French mercenaries and English exiles landing in Wales, where Tudor connections might provide support, and the army he gathered as he marched inland was small compared to the hosts that had clashed at Towton or Barnet. But Richard III found that many of the nobles he'd counted on proved reluctant to commit their forces fully to his defence, calculating that a Tudor victory might offer opportunities that continued Yorkist rule would not. And at the Battle of Bosworth on August 22, 1485, the defection of Lord Stanley and his forces during the fighting tipped the balance decisively against Richard, who died fighting in a final charge toward Henry Tudor's standard, the last English king to die in battle, and the last king of the Plantagenet line that had ruled England since 1154. Henry Tudor, crowned on the battlefield with Richard's circlet, would establish the Tudor dynasty, and would work systematically to eliminate potential rivals and to construct a new foundation for royal authority that did not depend on the consent of an overmighty nobility, and his marriage to Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, symbolically united the two branches of the royal family that had torn England apart for 30 years, though the actual work of pacification and reconstruction would take years and would require the execution or neutralisation of anyone with a plausible claim to challenge Tudor rule. The Wars of the Roses, as the conflict came to be known centuries later, when Romantic antiquarians sought a poetic name for the struggle between the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York, symbols that played almost no role in the actual fighting, and that obscure more than they illuminate, had killed a significant portion of the English nobility, not primarily in battle, though battlefield casualties were substantial, but through the judicial murders that followed each reversal of fortune, the attainders and executions that consumed both the leaders of failed rebellions and their followers, and the constant turnover in noble families meant that by 1485 the peerage looked very different than it had in 1450. New families raised from the gentry or from cadet branches replacing lines that had been extinguished, and this renewal of the nobility, combined with their exhaustion from decades of conflict and their impoverishment from the costs of maintaining retinues and fighting campaigns, made them less able and less willing to challenge royal authority, creating conditions in which the Tudor monarchs could construct a more centralised and powerful monarchy than their medieval predecessors had wielded, though the process would take generations and would never be complete, for the fundamental tension between royal power and aristocratic independence that had fueled the wars remained embedded in the structure of English governance and society, awaiting only the right combination of circumstances to erupt once more into violence, as it would in the 17th century when king and parliament would fight another civil war, but that lay far in the future, beyond the horizon visible to those who lived through the immediate aftermath of Bosworth, who knew only that the killing had stopped and that they might plant their crops and ply their trades without the constant fear that an army would sweep through demanding provisions or men, or simply taking what it wanted because armed men could take what they pleased from those who had no swords to resist.